I'm Mark Burgess. I chair OMFIF in Asia, and thanks very much for joining us for this discussion today. We've got a terrific group of panelists. I'll just very briefly introduce the panelists. I'm sure you're familiar with all three gentlemen who will be speaking today.
I'm Steve Grinville. Now I'm a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute, and I used to be the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia.
And I'm Bill White. I used to be the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, then the Chief Economist at the Bank for International Settlements. And then I was working at the OECD, and now I'm a Senior Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, Canada.
So thank you. My name is Kazumasa Iwata. I am the former Deputy Governor of Bank of Japan, and I worked the experience to work for the OECD Secretariat. So
look, I'm going to suggest that I'm going to suggest that Bill starts because he's the one who is going to give us the broadest framework. So over to you, Bill.
Well, why don't I say a few words about the state of the global economy before the pandemic hit, so that we know what it is that we have to contend with in the background. And sadly, I fear that the global economy, even before the pandemic hit, was really an accident waiting to happen. And one of the big reasons for that was global debt levels. So if you go back and you look at the International Institute for International Finance's debt calculations, they said that the level of debt in 2008 globally as a percentage of GDP was 280%. Well, by 2019, it was 320%. So if you thought that the crisis period was a period of deleveraging, think again. It was moving very much in the opposite direction. And the IIF calculates that by the end of 2020, if we get the recession that the IMF is predicting, which is, I think, just 3% of GDP minus, those numbers will go to 340%. So these are absolutely unprecedented debt levels. And they are a real source of concern. And the reason why is that, as Alan Greenspan used to say, debt is a headwind. You know, it slows down aggregate demand. The more that you use your credit and you build up your debt, the less opportunity you have to borrow and spend more in the future. And that, in a sense, is not the only thing that's wrong with debt, because when you're highly indebted, it makes you very vulnerable to all states of nature. So that if you're highly indebted and all of a sudden growth slows, then you don't have the revenues to service the debt and you go bankrupt. And conversely, if you get into a situation where growth is really quite rapid, but the interest rates rise, then your debt service costs go way up and you're bankrupt again. So there's a lot of vulnerability and exposure with debt. And prior to the crisis, we had plenty of it. The other thing that's sort of unfortunate is that there were other imbalances or strains in the economy as well. And I'll just say them very briefly. They had mostly to do with the financial markets. And when you think about ultra easy monetary policy, it really has pretty negative effects on all aspects of the financial sector. The first thing you'd want to focus on is the business models of the financial institutions. So the banks get their margins squeezed, the profits go down. They are in a more difficult situation for making loans going forward. When you look at the insurance companies and the pension funds, it was even worse because of these guys have got very long liabilities. So when the discount rate goes down and the liabilities go way up, they have a real problem. And then you add to that the fact that virtually everybody, when the yields are very, very low, is searching for yield. And they're doing all sorts of stuff, investing in the kinds of things that 20 years ago, people would have said were just totally mad. But that's exactly what's been going on for the last 10 years. Market functioning, I think we were getting increasing evidence over the last few years that market functioning was no longer working properly. And Mr. Iwata, you will know that in the JGB market, for example, basically no price discovery at all. But this kind of thing was going on elsewhere. And then we had all of these flash crashes and market anomalies, covered interest parity. The condition didn't hold anymore. The level of prices of so many financial assets, way up, huge potential for falls. So I won't even go into all of the sort of the supply side implications, the zombie companies. Let me just say that going into this crisis, there were a lot of things that were wrong in the functioning of the global economy that I would classify really as being almost like preconditions. And in the same sort of way, when the influenza, not the influenza, but the coronavirus hits an old person with pre-existing conditions, the effect can be fatal. And one can only hope, I think, given those pre-existing conditions in the global economy, that the kind of fiscal and monetary measures that the governments have taken out in the advanced market economies, that they'll be sufficient to offset that. But the prognosis, frankly, from my perspective, going forward, is that our starting point was not a good one.
Thanks very much, Bill. And I'm sorry that I dropped out there. Perhaps one of the first fiscal areas is better infrastructure here in Australia, but it's the first time it's happened in this situation. But Bill, I might just ask you to, again, just to very briefly, you and I talked about the framework, the steps, and it is path dependent looking forward. You could maybe just summarise those three sort of steps and just approximately how you're analysing through those to give us a forward-looking view as to where we go from here.
Well, I mean, the first question really is, let me just say this: I've been in this business for 50 years. I've never seen a situation that is uncertain as this one. And it's uncertain for all sorts of reasons. And I'm taking you through the phases. Phase one is the phase of the pandemic. Okay? It's not the pandemic itself that's causing all the economic damage. It's the lockdown and it's the social distancing that's doing it. It's a policy that we've decided to put in place, quite rightly, to flatten the curve so that the hospitals can cope and that there's no unnecessary, unpleasant deaths. When's that going to end? And the answer is we don't know. We don't even have very clear criteria. We don't even have clear indications from the governments about what criteria they will use in making the decision to relax the lockup. So profound uncertainty at the first stage while the pandemic is still with us. Then you get into the second phase, which let's say is the recovery phase. And that's where we get back to all the stuff that I've just been talking about. Will all of those things kick in, as it were, and turn a bad situation into a desperate one? Or will they not? And the answer is none of us really know. And then the third stage is, let's suppose we've managed to get out of this thing and we have recovered. What kind of a world do we want to be recovering towards? And I remind you, the G20, you know, back in 2009 and 2010, they profoundly changed the framework within which policy was to be conducted. And they did that by changing the objectives of policy. So whereas in the old days, it was all a question of just, we want strong growth. Okay? The G20 basically turned that into something very different, which was strong, sustainable, inclusive, and now, of course, people are talking resilient. And so you get all of these new issues as we look forward. We need a more resilient society, corporations just in time, all that stuff. We need a greener society. Climate change has not gone away. It's a huge threat. It's still out there. The inclusiveness thing, we're seeing more and more concerns. The poor are being left behind. And I might point out that the pandemic and the lockdown is hitting the poor folks much more than it's hurting the knowledge workers like us who can continue doing what we're doing right now. The people that work in the bars aren't in that happy situation. So whether it's the pandemic itself, the recovery phase, or the endpoint, there's enormous uncertainty about where it's all going.
Thanks very much for setting up that framework, Bill. And I might go to Awada-san now and just talk about your observations, perhaps in that framework in Japan and in Asia, and how you're observing things at the moment, and again, looking forward, how that's possibly going to play out.
Okay, thank you very much. Very nice presentation by Mr. White. I enjoy very much. And so on the actual situation in Japan, recently our Prime Minister Abe declared the state of emergency. Japan's containment policy was mild and the death rate is small, but gradually the number of infection is increasing. So he was obliged to declare this state of emergency. And the negative impact of this emergency statement would be very serious. Japanese economic growth rate would become negative 8%, much larger than the forecast by IMF forecast 5.2% negative. So, but looking at this very huge negative impact, and the great problem is this uncertainty over the future development of infection of coronavirus. And nobody knows how about the final future course. And IMF provided four scenarios. The base scenario assumes the recovery will start after mid this year. But I find this is too much optimistic. And at least this situation, maybe the repetition of strict containment policy and more mild containment policy, this may be repeating a kind of cycle. And this situation continues until the end of this year. And finally, anyway, the remedy medicine or vaccine development will solve this a cycle of this corona infection. So therefore, this is a little bit longer term, problem, not very short run. And therefore, we should be prepared how to, coexist with this containment policy and consistent with the economic activity. If we take too long and too hard containment policy, then creates a very difficult problem for the economic policy. So, and my Japanese way of tackling this is somehow mild containment policy, somehow allow the economic activity at the same time. And this strategy will succeed or not, it would be revealed maybe 6 May, when this period of state of emergency will be ended. And the final outcome is coming, therefore, early May, whether they continue this state emergency policy or not. But my personal guess is, according to this IMF scenario, the risk scenario, that is 50% longer to start recovery, and the possibility of a second wave of coronavirus. That is risk scenario 1 and 2 combination, and is most likely. According to this assumption, our growth rate is much lower than the IMF forecast, 5.2%, but we assume 8% negative growth rate. And given this huge shock, the G20 now preparing the various things, but I find compared with the international cooperation at the time, global financial crisis, this time it's so a lot of confrontation between China and the United States, and unfortunately this prevents the working of international cooperation process. Notably, we should declare very clearly, G20 should make a clear statement on the action plan to overcome globally the virus. This is the coronavirus. This is a strong statement we need. And item 1 of this action is a coordinated actions to develop the medicine and the vaccine, and also the some aid to poor countries for medical infrastructure and others. This is the first urgent, task. And the second one is this monetary field. Monetary policy almost exhausted. In the case of Japan, BOJ almost exhausted all the instrument. So therefore, little room remained. However, on the international field, I think central banks took a very concerted action on the central bank liquidity swap line. Last time, that is global financial crisis, liquidity, in order to avoid the liquidity crisis, this instrument was so effective. And this is a kind of global US monetary policy, but together with 14 central banks, including Australia and other countries. And this time, it proved it is also quite effective to dampen the liquidity crisis. And Japan, Bank of Japan already utilized this swap line this time. Larger amount of dollar, we have utilized compared with the global financial crisis, and that worked very well and calmed down the currency swap market and calmed down this liquidity shortage, global shortage of dollar. So, but however, I think at the same time we need more aggressive one, that is extending this swap line to other countries and increasing the amount of dollar available for other central banks. This is one point of this global, coordination. And on the Asia, similar problem exists. There is a regional safety net. That is the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. The total amount of fund is available is 240. And once Dr. Basri, he is the former fiscal financial minister, he argued the amount available for Indonesia was too small at the time of global financial crisis. Therefore, this fund was not utilized. It was established but never used, quite unfortunate. So I find, therefore, it's a good thing to double the size of this, Chiang Mai Initiative Fund, and also to allow more easy access and maybe more moderately linking it with the conditionality of IMF and easy access, and also extend the membership of this Chiang Mai Fund to other countries, maybe Australia and New Zealand, other countries as well, and to very well equipped with this safety net, international safety net. On the IMF, I think additionally, it's reasonable to expand the, the size of SDR issue. Already after the global financial crisis, to $250, available, but now it's better to double it, and so $500 billion something. And these are the safety net prevent the global liquidity crisis. And this liquidity crisis will easily leading to the debt crisis at the corporate sector, high yield bond market and municipal bond market and others, energy, notably the corporate debt is a huge problem. And this is a great, this liquidity crisis will easily lead to debt crisis. We should prevent it and prevent the bankruptcies of corporate sector and the household sector. And this is the needed action. So finally, and the recovery process, small word on this, in order to coexist with the sustained corona risk exposure, I think we should somewhat relax the constraint arising from the medical capacity in the countries. And that implies we mobilize all the resources to the bottleneck, notably in the medical service sector. And at the same time, in order to mitigate the negative impact arising from this stringent constraint, we utilize fully the technology, that is the digital technology. We are facing now the challenge to transform our economy into digitalization. So digital transformation is a big agenda for all over the world. And I think Japan should do more promote this this tendency. This is one of the way, and the second way, and the third way is the testing. Japan's problem is too small number of testing, and quite unfortunate. We should test not only this corona testing, but also the antibody testing, and to separate the people who is infected and not people already have the antibody. And then the partial mobilization is becoming available, and so that could facilitate the recovery process, more easily.
So what we might do now is thank you very much for Wada-san. And you've looked at things like G20, the IMF, the structure around it. But I know, Stephen, you put a lot of thought into what's being asked of central banks, what the implications are, whether the cure that we're applying to try and get through this is going to result in illnesses that we're not expecting in the economy. I noticed in one of your notes here, you mentioned the word Weimar, which is always sends a shiver up our spines, perhaps. So without putting words in your mouth, Stephen, could you interpret, particularly at the local level, the central bank level, and what's going on with policy here to try and sustain this, and the bridge that's happening with fiscal, which is very different this cycle, I think, to what we've seen before?
Yeah. Yes,
thanks,
I think
Mark.
the policy. Thank you.
Awada-san, we'll just ask Stephen will tackle this particular question. So I'll ask Stephen to answer. So, Stephen.
Okay. Can I answer?
Thanks.
Yeah, in just a minute. So, Stephen, yeah, thanks.
Just a minute. On monetary policy, as I have said, already exhausted. But the consequence of this coronavirus is coming back of deflation in Japan. According to our forecast, our deflation rate will be between 1% and 2%. So this is just coming back to the before the global financial crisis, and so in the during the course of 1990s and 20 years deflation, and Abenomics somehow partially overcome this problem, but now we are going back to this problem again, -1 or 2% negative inflation rate. Second one is this is a secular stagnation. After the global financial crisis, the advanced economies face this problem characterized by the low natural interest rate. Japan already preceding other countries on this aspect. We face this secular stagnation after the bubble bursting period. That was the mid-1990s. We had the negative natural rate, and I find now after this corona shock, we advanced economies, including United States, even United States would face the negative natural rate. That creates additional difficulty for central bank, given too low negative interest rate, neutral rate. Then if there is a zero lower bound, effective lower bound, then my hope is only remaining one is negative interest rate. Already ECB, this is a negative 0.75%, the provision of liquidity on the market. Japan is standing at the negative 0.1% at the deposit rate at the BOJ account, but nothing carried out negative interest rate on the provision of credit to the market, still at the zero rate. But I find that there is a way, to take down this interest rate to negative territory. I think QE is not so a good policy. Better to move to this interest rate policy again.
Okay, so what we'll do is, Stephen, what's your interpretation? I think that does set up an interesting example of what's happening in Japan relative to your own thinking as to how this will play out. Stephen, how is this likely to work in your view?
Thanks, Mark. Look, we've been in crises before. This isn't the first time we've had a world crisis, but I think this is very different from the ones we've experienced recently. 2008 was clearly a crisis in the financial sector with all those problems that Bill referred to, and of course they're worse. But I'd like to suggest there's an even bigger challenge for policymakers and the central banks, and that is that this crisis will cause such a fall in output, such a rise in unemployment, that it will be necessary to run very big budget deficits. So the question is, how do you fund them? Now, in the OECD countries, there seems to be a great readiness among central banks to fund these by money finance budget deficits, by, in the old lexicon, by printing money. And this raises all the old historical memories of the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, when people had wheelbarrows to take their cash round to make payments. And of course, much more recently, in fact, in my personal experience, we had the inflation in Sukarno's Indonesia during the 1960s. So these things are not all that out of mind. But I think this is a different world. I think this is a major emergency, and that this kind of money-funded deficits may be the sort of things that you have to do, the sort of things that the US is doing with QE infinity, Bank of Japan is doing by yield curve management, the Bank of England is doing via offering to pick up the bill for the deficit. But in the background, there are all those concerns. This may be, in Mario Draghi's famous words, you've got to do whatever it takes. But there are some problems that this leaves in people's minds. Inflation is only one of them. The other problem that comes up again and again is the question of central bank independence. Now, there is, I think, closer to home in Southeast Asia, while it's suffering from all of those challenges and issues, there is another problem, and that is the possibility of capital outflow. The Institute of International Finance has measured that there's 100 billion of capital outflow that's already occurred from the emerging countries. But I'd like to say, serious though this is, people should be ready for it. They are better equipped to handle this. If I look at Indonesia, it has big reserves. I think the problem they're not ready for yet is the problem of the need for a huge budget deficit. Their current plans are to go from 3% deficit to 5%. That is not enough to handle the sort of crisis that I think may be happening in Indonesia and in other countries as well. So I think the important priority is to think in terms of how do we arrange the financial sector, crippled as it is by all the problems that Bill talked about earlier. How do we arrange the financial sector so that it will be possible for all these countries to run very big budget deficits? They're not expecting it yet. The ADB only a month ago predicted 2.5% growth for Indonesia, 4% growth for India. We're economists, we've been around for a long while. We know that anything can happen. That is possible, but it seems extremely unlikely. I think what these countries are headed for is a very serious recession, and they need a very big budget deficit to offset it.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I think what's interesting, you're also pointing to countries that, as we look forward, have some of the best demographic profiles for future growth, and yet currently are facing some of the most serious challenges. Bill, did you want to weigh in? And I get asked this question a lot. Is this inflationary or deflationary, what we're dealing with here over time? And what's your response to the way policy has worked here?
Well, I think the answer is both of the above, depending on the time frame. I think in the near future here, I mean, particularly in light of the downward revisions to the IMF forecast, because of the fact that the virus is not going to go away, we're going to have a very disinflationary period for an extended period of time. I think the central banks and the governments will double down on the policies that they've used in the past, which is the deficits will get even bigger, the government deficits will get even bigger. There will be ever more reliance on the central bank to do the financing. And it may well be that that will lead to a recovery. If so, I suspect that there will be an extended period of financial repression, like there was after World War II, which will involve a lot of administrative and capital controls and things of that nature. And the whole idea will be to get some inflation, to get some growth, so that the nominal economy is growing faster, and the interest rates are held down by these administrative means. so that the burden of the debt just gradually disappears. We did this after World War II. It was possible then. It'll take much stronger administrative controls in the modern digital world, of course, but it's possible. However, if we don't get that, we will eventually get to a point where we're into what I call a Sergeant Wallace world. And some of you may remember this famous article of theirs in the early 1990s, I think, which is called Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic. And they take you through the theory of how a big fiscal deficit will, in the end, overcome the central bank's unwillingness to print the money. There'll be fiscal dominance. They'll eventually have to do it. And then you get into big inflation, hyperinflation, and as Steve mentioned, Weimar. And my old colleague at the University of Basel, a guy called Peter Bernholz, has written a whole book about inflations and hyperinflations and historical precedents. And it's not just Indonesia in the 1960s. I mean, it goes all the way back to Chinese currency. When they first invented currency, ended up in hyperinflation. The assignat during the French Revolution. And the story goes on and on. So it is absolutely possible. It is not to say that it's the most likely outcome, but to say it's not possible would be just to disregard all the lessons of history.
Thanks very much, Bill. I know we have a number of asset owners and investors on the call, and you've just sent a shiver down their spines from repression to inflation. Certainly, they're going to prove their mettle in the next decade, perhaps. I think we'll try and open up to questions, and I'm sorry that I dropped out at the beginning. But do we have any questions on the call? And Angela, you might guide us here if you need to at your end. Do we have any questions? And please feel free to speak up. If we don't, I might just key off with yourself, Stephen. I'm struck in the last 35 years. I'm old enough to have seen the 1987 stock market crash, as early stage of my career, and people got that wrong. They thought a depression was following, but the reason they got it wrong was because central banks stepped in. They'd learnt the lesson of the depression, and we've really spent 35 years of the so-called Greenspan put. And I'm struck that in the good times in the last 3 or 4 years, even lay audiences that don't follow macroeconomics would ask me whether central banks could save us in the next recession when there was no recession in sight. I worry that we've just become habitually attached to this, that this is becoming an issue. Where are we at in terms of the way central banks can respond to this, and really their standing as we see going forward? How is that put going?
That's an interesting question. Thanks, Mark. Look, I think there are a lot of limits on what central banks can do at the moment. Clearly, they can't lower interest rates very much more. In most cases, can't lower them at all. But in any case, I don't think that's the issue. I don't think lower interest rates would do much good. In fact, monetary policy should be seen as being very expansionary right now. It's not how you changed it. It's what the actual level of interest rates are. And the level of interest rates, as Bill said, is so low that even zombie companies can keep on going. So there's nothing that can be done on interest rates in the traditional way. But of course, this other issue, which Bill also alluded to, this question of money-funded deficits, I think that's the big issue where central banks can help, because they can make possible the deficits which are indeed very necessary at the moment. But of course, in helping, there's some dangers in that. I couldn't agree more with Bill on the question of repression. I don't think inflation is the worry about this money printing. I don't think we're in Milton Friedman's world of money chasing goods. People don't get a cash splash or a helicopter drop and run out and spend it. If there was a helicopter drop, and fiscal policy sometimes does things a bit like that, people might spend a bit of it, but what they don't want to spend, they don't have to bid up inflation. They can put it in their bank, and the bank doesn't want that currency, so it puts it in reserves. Reserves go up, and their balance sheet is loaded with too many reserves. If you look at the central bank balance sheets all around the world, this is the world that Bill was talking about earlier. The world of financial repression, when the balance sheets of the banks are messed up by the bonds which they're forced to hold. The financial system is messed up by the low interest rate. That's the world that I would worry about. But in the meantime, there is a super urgent problem, which is to fund bigger deficits. So I think if there is no way of funding it through normal methods of bond issue, then I think central banks should, as a very special, exceptional circumstances, be prepared to fund it and be thinking about how do we get out of this when the crisis is over.
And just turning to the G20.
I want to answer. May I?
Yes.
This is the future development of this deficit, fiscal deficit. Currently, among advanced economies, US has the highest deficit now. According to IMF, this is 15% of nominal GDP. This is the highest. Japan's case may be closer, but a little bit lower than this, close to 10% or 11%, something after this corona shock. And the implication I'm concerned about it, this accumulation, government debt, and another one is external financial debt in the United States. Currently, United States accumulated foreign debt about close $8 trillion. That is about 40% of nominal GDP. I have made the simulation exercise, long-term forecast until the year 2060. According to our forecast, I made several scenarios. In the case of 10% budget deficit continuation by the US government, the outcome on the current account balance is larger than 3% current account deficit. So the widen the budget deficit and widen the current account deficit. This is the twin deficit we have already seen in the mid-1980s. Suffering this twin deficit, US embarked on the artificial dollar depreciation policy, that is the Plaza Accord, and Japan suffered too rapid and the size of too sizable appreciation. We entered this one of the factors why Japanese economy entered secular stagnation, too high appreciation, and also demographic factors. This is looking at this development in Japan. So during the course of the demographic changes, saving investment balance, that the outcome is current account surplus or deficit. Japan continued current account surplus throughout this period. In the process of the aging process of demography, this aging process, accompanied by the changes in investment and the saving in the private sector. But looking at this process, corporate sector excess saving, tendency increased so sharply. At the same time, we have seen the widening budget deficit. We have 240% debt of nominal GDP. This is the highest among advanced economies. But what was the outcome? And BOJ engaged in this kind of monetizing of this deficit. Once QE, 80 trillion yen, purchase of JGB. The size of budget deficit, this new issue of bond is only 30 or 35 trillion. This exceeding the size of fiscal deficit. This huge accumulation of this, a purchase of the BOJ, virtually this monetization of fiscal deficit. So all these three things happened. But what was the outcome? As I said, after the corona shock, deflation. Why? Even the widening fiscal deficit, but at the same time, corporate sector saving increased so largely. Retained earnings. Now the Japanese corporation, 400 trillion yen. They hold a huge amount of cash and the deposit. The amount is more than 200 trillion yen. Oh, huge, this liquidity. Therefore, this working as a kind of shock absorber against this, liquidity crisis. This somehow softened, this negative impact. But what I want to say, therefore, my prediction over the future, long-term future, even though demographic changes and widening fiscal deficit, still we would have the secular stagnation. That's the natural rate down. And at the same time, still due to the excess saving, this downward trend continued. Bank of England economist once published an interesting working paper. Since the 14th century, there is a global tendency of long-term interest rate down, closer to zero. That's also supra-secular stagnation, phenomena we observe. I think even after this corona, I see this continuation of very, very long-term development of real, long-term interest rate. And we have kind of deflationary, and maybe lower growth, even though there is a digital, transformation. Digital transformation, most advanced economy is United States. But looking at the performance of labor productivity, whether it's really, jump up, no. Why? I think there is a, a decreasing trend of labor share. That is increasing income inequality. And this increased excess saving tendency, at the level of household, because of the squeezed wages and rich people accumulating saving, and a final result is excess saving tendency persistent. So the difficult task for central bank, given this very low natural rate, we suffered this problem already since the mid 1990s. How to cope this? We engaged in a quantitative easing policy, but failed to overcome this deflation. So,
okay, thanks. Thank you very much. We'll open up for questions if we can. Are there any questions that you would like to ask our excellent panelists? I'm not sure whether people are having trouble getting the questions through to us, or is there any questions?
Mark, we've got one question. If you can take a look on the question panel.
Okay, I can't actually see it. Could you read it out for us, Angela?
Sure. So this is from James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School. He asked questions where can participants give a view of their outlook for emerging markets during the current crisis, which are most vulnerable to financial risk and why?
I might start with yourself, Bill, if that's okay.
Well, the emerging markets, well, they've already taken a huge hit. I mean, the IIF says that the capital outflows here in the course of the last few months have been bigger than has ever been seen before. The coronavirus is, and of course, as I said before, many of those emerging markets, the imbalances, the pre-existing complaints that I spoke of before, they started in the advanced market economies, but they quickly spread to the emerging market economies too. Even things, for example, like the financial sector. So you look at countries like India and China, which are huge amongst the emerging markets. And we saw this massive migration of funds into the shadow banking system. And it's already coming back in India to cause them a lot of problems, bankruptcies and whatever. So these countries have also started with, pre-existing conditions. Now they've been hit with the capital outflows. Now they're going to be hit by the spread of the pandemic. And they've got very few domestic resources to deal with it, on the fiscal side in particular. So they will be, many of them, well, and not they will be, they have already given notice to the fund. I think there's 79 countries that have come to the fund already to say we need help. The G20 has already said that they're going to put off the bilateral interest payments and the principal repayments to the end of the year. But there's a general sentiment this is nowhere near going to be enough to help these people. They've got, I think, something of the order of there's $5 trillion worth of debt that's been issued in emerging market countries that's denominated in dollars. So you get the magnitude of the problem is really very, very large. I personally have been beating the drum recently. And this goes back to the question you asked Steve about what can the central banks do? The answer is, for all practical purposes, nothing, because what they do, and for that matter, what fiscal expansion does too, monetary expansion expands private debt. Fiscal expansion expands sovereign debt. But both of them are debt, and both of them constitute headwinds that make things worse, not better, over time. So we have a real problem here. I think we should be spending much more time on attacking the debt problem directly, which is restructuring. And the G20, the IMF, and the OECD, Working Party 1, have been putting enormous efforts into identifying ways in which our judicial and administrative processes to restructure debt are seriously deficient. And they are most deficient with respect to sovereign debt restructuring. And this will apply to a lot of the emerging market countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We have no agreed criteria for when countries need to restructure. And so they will always wind up sort of doing what needs to be done far too late. So if we started thinking not so much about the economics, but the administrative, regulatory, and judicial components of this problem, I think there'd be a very big payoff.
Thanks, Bill. You make an excellent point there about the processes that are required around. I might just check with Andrew to see if there's any other questions. Are there any there? I'm sorry, I'm unable to see it.
May I
yes.
answer to this financial additional 2 points? One of the points is emerging economies, risks. We see now the massive capital outflow from the emerging economy. The size of outflow in March was much larger than the case of global financial crisis. And this massive capital outflow accompanied by the depreciation of the currency. And at the same time, oil price decline, even the sub-zero, oil price appeared, and the commodity price down because of the, demand shock arising on China, firstly, and then the second shock for the emerging economy, and the third shock is the deterioration of terms of trade because of this export price down and the exchange rate down. And these three problems, in addition, already $3.7 trillion external debt, dollar-denominated debt. And now we see the very high level of dollar value in these days. And therefore, I think there are 3 or 4 problems at the same time, for the emerging economy. Therefore, this is a big problem. How to, provide appropriate amount of money or lending to these countries. And this is the first point I want to make. And the second one is dollar appreciation. Whether this is sustainable or not, I have already mentioned. So far, so good. So huge fiscal expansion, and so that accompanied by, appreciation of dollar so far. But after this, if they face really twin deficit, and a similar thing could happen in the mid-1980s, that is the sharp depreciation of dollar. That creates another problem for Japan. Japan going to enter deflation, but there may be a vicious circle and restart again. This the excessive appreciation and the deflation, very difficult to move out. And this is therefore a sharp change of dollar value is another risk. And the third point is stress, appeared already. This time difference from the global financial crisis is the cause of this shock is arising from real sector. That is the bankruptcy risk of company or the household sector. This is quite different. At the time global financial crisis, the financial institution, notably banking sector, had the shock. And the origin of shock is very different. So therefore, we should provide ample, lending to avoid the bankruptcy risk of companies and household. Therefore, fiscal transfer, massive transfer, is carried out in major economies, and therefore this is inevitable. So
I think, yeah. Thank you very much.
Therefore, yeah.
Thanks, Sawada-san. I mean, we're talking about two aspects there. Bill's discussing, which is absolutely critical, the management of the debt process at the government level and how that's done, and the plumbing of that, and of course the management of the debt challenges in terms of resolution. You mentioned also at the corporate and other sector. Angela, you've got a question?
Yeah, so we received like 3 questions here. So I'll read out the first one. So how seriously, if at all, is modern monetary theory being taken among leading economic thinkers? At what level of money printing is inflation likely to start becoming an issue? Thank you.
Can we take the second and third questions, and we'll allow the panel to choose them. We've only got 5 minutes or so to go. So the second and third?
Sure. And the second question is, most countries implement similar policy measures. What is the difference in policy measures should be in developing low-income countries versus developed high-income countries?
Right.
And then we've got the third questions is, this question is directed to Steve Granville. I understand the major priority to flatten the curve so that health systems are not overloaded. But once infection rates are under control, as in Australia and New Zealand, thankfully at the present time, does there become a valid argument that the cost of containment exceed the benefits? And as has been suggested, especially with the cost falling, particularly on the poor. Alternately, is there a lower cost strategy whereby older and more vulnerable people continue to be contained and more of the economy is allowed to reopen while continuing to practice social distancing? So this is from Ruben from NAB.
We may only have time to take one of those answers, but Stephen, you've been asked particularly on the third one, but feel free to take whichever or all if you want to give it a go. Thanks.
Well, that's an invitation, but I know we've only got 5 minutes. Look, the specific question on the Australian situation, I think it's very interesting. I don't think we had an opportunity to ease off earlier. I think we did the right thing, and we were fortunate enough because the virus was coming to us just a little bit slower than everywhere else. We actually put on very strict measures early on, and we now have world-class low rates. New Zealand and Australia we had 4 new cases yesterday. It's almost disappeared. So the question now is how quickly you get back and solve these problems that the questioner asked about the huge damage it's doing to the GDP. So very quickly, my view is we should be taking off the constraints very quickly, but we will have 2 or 3 constraints still on. We've got very strict quarantine, keeping the borders closed. We need to not have big crowds because they look like the great vulnerability. And we need to do something about old people. Speaking as an old person, we're very vulnerable and they need to do something to protect us. Look, we've only got 5 minutes. I'd love to come back on the first question on modern monetary theory, but I'd better give others a chance to say something.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Modern monetary theory, look, I think all of these things, they have different names. Modern monetary theory, quantitative easing, helicopter money, they're all variations on the idea that you get the central bank to fund government spending. And it has all the problems and worries that Bill referred to earlier. I don't think the immediate problem is inflation, but the immediate problem is messing up the financial sector by having wrong interest rates and loading assets onto balance sheets that the banks would prefer not to have. I think that's under this general rubric of repressed financial systems that McKinnon talked about many years ago. That's the immediate danger. I think the inflationary danger is somewhat further into the future. But having said that, and having said that it raises questions of central bank independence and all sorts of worrying issues like that, if the problem is serious enough, as it is, for instance, in Indonesia, that they cannot have an appropriately large budget deficit because they can't fund it, then I would do it now. This is an emergency situation. This is Mario Draghi again, whatever it takes. So I would go ahead when there's no alternative funding available.
And we might just finish up because we are running out of time, Bill, but I'm going to ask a direct question. We haven't talked that much about the G20. My sense is, and I think it was said, that the G20 had a golden period in the last crisis. This one...
May I add one point?
Sure.
Yeah, modern monetary theory. I think core part of this modern monetary theory, is Keynesian, traced back to the tradition of Keynes. And Keynes argued, as long as the one country has a monetary sovereignty, that is issue a government bond in its own currency, denominated bond. If this monetary sovereignty maintained, and that there is no case of default of the government because they can print money, if they wish, and so there is different from the private company's case. If the private company issues debt unlimitedly, then suddenly there is a bankruptcy. But the government case, they have the tax, sovereignty, behind this monetary sovereignty. Therefore, my interpretation of this modern monetary theory is, as long as tax authority continue to want to collect tax at certain level, and if reverse way, if the tax authority abandon the certain amount of the tax revenue, abandoned entirely, then there is a risk of inflation. This is an unlimited amount of debt, but abandon the tax collection, and so then the case Mr. White argued, this risk will appear.
Thanks very much, Bill. I will let you have the last word, but I might just ask you about coordination, about what you're observing and what the implications are of the way the world's policy is being coordinated at present. If you want to take that question as we round out that.
Can I just take 30 seconds to talk about the pandemic? And following up on what Steve has said, if you're fortunate enough or ruthless enough to be able to totally eradicate the thing, then absolutely one moves very quickly to get rid of the lockdown. The problem is that once the thing is well spread, absent a vaccine, the inevitable end in this thing is herd immunity, which means a massive increase in infections over time. And when you flatten the curve, all you're doing is you're pushing the illness out into the future. And so it will come back in what hopes would be ever declining waves. But there, the fundamental question is whether the hospitals can cope. And that's the principal moral question that we have to face. On the international cooperation, I read the G20 communique from the virtual meeting. There is nothing of any specificity in there to encourage one to believe that we have or will get anything like what happened in 2009. So that really has been a very big disappointment. Mr. Iwata said that the Chinese and the Americans are at each other's throats. I wasn't there, but I have no difficulty in believing that. The IMF has actually made some progress. They've got some more money. They've expanded a couple of their funds. But they talk about $1 trillion worth of firepower. But, honestly, most of that stuff can only go to countries that are asking for conditional help. And to impose conditionality on countries that are already facing enormous fiscal challenges and medical challenges, it strikes me as that's not the right way to go. So if you talk about what have we got from international cooperation, my sense of it is not a very great deal at the fiscal level. Monetary level, whether it's cooperation, somehow they got together in Basel and sorted it out, or whether they've just all done the stuff that they know the central banks needed to do independently, I simply do not know.
So on that note, thanks very much, Bill. I think what we can summarize is that the best leaders globally have unfortunately retired, and most are on the call today. So we're going to get you back into service, I think, to get better coordination. But thanks very much for joining the call. It's a very serious situation. I think the panel has gone through the range of prospects. I heard repression, I heard the possibility of inflation. As we said halfway through the call, it's going to be challenging. Thanks very much, and thanks for joining us today.